Caleb Vane rode with the fog clinging to him like a shroud. The dampness was a cold promise, soaking through his woolen coat, settling deep in the marrow of his bones. It was a feeling he remembered, a ghost of the damp that lived in trenches, in long marches through rain-soaked forests where men coughed their lungs out and looked at you with eyes that had seen too much. He was 31 years old, but some mornings, like this one, he felt 100. His horse, a steady bay, shifted beneath him, blowing out a nervous breath that plumed white in the gray air. The animal did not like the fog. Caleb could not blame it. The fog hid holes. It hid snakes. It hid the truth of the land. He had been riding for 3 days toward this patch of Montana, this square on a map that the paper in his breast pocket claimed was his. The paper was crisp, legal. It had a seal and a signature. In Caleb's world. A world rebuilt after being torn apart by war. Paper and law were the only things that held. They were the girders over the chasm. He had put his faith in this particular piece of paper. It was his new beginning, the place where he would build something that could not be marched over or burned down. He was a hard man. The war had made sure of that. He had learned to make decisions, to follow orders, and to see a task through to its end. This was just another task. Take possession of his property. The thought was simple, clean. But the fog made nothing simple. It turned the world into a mystery. He was in the high hill country, or so the map told him. He should be seeing wide-open vistas, valleys carved by ancient water, mountains sharp against a blue sky. Instead, he saw nothing but a wall of shifting gray. A world reduced to a circle of 20 yards. The silence was profound, broken only by the plod of his horse's hooves on the damp earth and the drip of moisture from unseen pines. The air smelled of wet stone and pine resin. It was a lonely smell, a smell of endings, not beginnings. He checked the paper again, folding it open with stiff fingers. The ink was precise. Section 4, Township 8. The Dunn property, or rather, the former Dunn property. The bank in Helena had been quite clear. The note was forfeit. The land was auctioned. He had bought it legally, paid his money. He was not a thief, he was an owner. Yet a knot of something unwelcome, a feeling he refused to name, had settled in his stomach. Taking a man's land, even legally, felt different out here, in the East. It was a matter of ledgers and courtrooms. Out here, land was not just dirt. It was sweat. It was blood. It was the only thing a person had to fight against the crushing emptiness of the sky. He had fought for ideals, for a flag, for the notion of a country whole. He had seen men die for those things. But here, men died for 160 acres of dirt that might or might not grow wheat. He understood that. It was real. It was tangible, and he was here to take it from someone else. This internal argument had been circling in his head for the last mile, a vulture riding the same currents as the fog. He pushed it down. The law was the law. Without it, there was only chaos. He had seen enough chaos to last a lifetime. Then, through the mist, a shape emerged. At first, it was just a darker smudge of gray, a fence line. It was made of split rails, old, silvered by weather. One of the posts was canted over, the rails resting on the ground. It was a poor sort of fence, built with more stubbornness than skill. He guided the bay toward a rickety gate. Beyond it, the fog thinned just enough to reveal more. A house. It was not a fine house. It was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud that was weeping in the damp. A tendril of wood smoke, pale and thin, rose from a stone chimney and was immediately swallowed by the fog. It was the only sign of life. That and a few nervous chickens scratching near the porch, a lean-to shed, more of a collection of hopeful boards than a real structure, slumped beside the cabin. A single bony milk cow stared at him with liquid brown eyes from a small corral. This was it. This was the prize. This small, struggling piece of hope set against a wilderness that seemed determined to swallow it whole. The fields he could dimly see were not thriving. They were patches of stubble, dry, choked with weeds. But they were also laid out in neat, stubborn rows. Someone had poured their life into this ground, fighting for every stalk of corn, every potato. The place smelled of wood smoke, of damp earth, and of a deep, abiding weariness. Caleb dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft mud. The bay shook its head, harness jangling, the sound unnerving, sharp in the quiet. He tied the reins to the fence post, his movements deliberate, slow. He was aware of the silence from the house. They had heard him. They were watching. He could feel their eyes. He pushed the gate open. It scraped the ground with a sound like a pained groan. He stepped through, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. It was not a conscious threat, just a habit. The war had taught him that. 2. Never walk into an unknown situation with empty hands. He looked toward the cabin, and he saw a man. The man was visible only as a silhouette in the single front window. He was standing, but he looked frail. His shoulders stooped. He did not move. He just watched. Caleb felt the weight of that gaze. It was not angry. It was not fearful. It was just heavy, like the land itself. This must be Jeremiah Dunn, the man who had broken this ground, the man who had failed to pay his note. Caleb started to walk toward the porch. Each step felt loud, an intrusion. The fog swirled around his knees. He felt like a bad omen, a figure from a grim story come to deliver the final, cruel line. He kept his face hard, a mask he had perfected years ago. Feelings were a luxury. They got in the way of the mission. His mission was simple: present the papers, take possession. Then the cabin door opened. It opened slowly, scraping on the floorboards. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was not what he expected. He did not know what he had expected. A worn-out frontierswoman, perhaps old before her time, or a cowering girl. She was neither. She was tall, or seemed so, with a straightness to her back that spoke of pride. Her hair was a dark brown, pulled back tight from her face, but strands had escaped in the damp and clung to her temples. Her dress was plain, faded calico, patched at the elbows, wet at the hem from the long grass. Her hands were red, rough-looking. She was holding a small, empty bucket. She had likely been on her way to the well. She stood perfectly still, watching him. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, but her eyes, they were old. They were as old as the hills, as old as the sorrow that seemed to seep from the very soil. There was no fear in them. There was exhaustion, and a deep, defiant strength that resonated with something inside him. It was the same look he had seen in soldiers who knew they were going to die, but had decided to stand their ground anyway. This was Rosalind Dunn, the daughter. Caleb stopped walking. He was 10 yards from the porch. The two of them just stood, locked in a silent confrontation across the misty yard. The chickens had stopped scratching. The cow had stopped chewing. Even the fog seemed to pause, waiting. He saw the pain etched around her eyes, the tightness in her mouth. This was not just land to her. This was everything. This was her home, her life, her father breathing shallowly behind the glass. He saw the resilience, the iron in her spine. She had suffered. He could see that plain as day. Life out here was a hard teacher. It had taught her to endure, to stand, to protect what was hers. A choice. He had come here as a man of law, a man with a simple task. But looking at her, at this place, at the frail man in the window, the simplicity evaporated. The fog was not just outside anymore. It was inside him, thick and confusing, blurring the sharp lines between what was right and what was legal. He knew he should speak. He should state his name, his business. He should present the paper that was burning a hole in his pocket. But the words caught in his throat. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, her gaze unwavering. He saw no plea in her eyes. Not yet. He saw only a statement. "I am here," "This is ours. You will have to go through me." Caleb Vane, the hard man, the veteran, the new owner, took a slow breath. The damp air filled his lungs, but it did not clear his head. He was a man who had faced cannon fire without flinching. But the sight of this one woman, standing on a sagging porch in the middle of a foggy Montana morning, with nothing but her own will to defend her, shook him to his very core. He had come to take her land. He knew in that instant that he was walking into a battle he did not understand, one that his pistol and his legal papers could not win. The meeting, he realized, was not going to change just his day. It was going to change his life. He took one more step toward the porch. Caleb stepped onto the porch. The wood was soft under his boot, springy with rot. The woman, Rosalind Dunn, did not move back. She held her ground. The bucket in her hand was held in a white-knuckled grip. He removed his hat. It was a gesture of civility he had been taught as a boy, but it felt hollow, a lie in this place. "Ma'am, I am looking for Jeremiah Dunn." Her eyes flickered to the breast of his coat, to the square outline of the paper he had not yet pulled from his pocket. She knew. Of course she knew. News of a foreclosure traveled faster than a prairie fire. "He cannot see anyone," she said. Her voice was low, like stones rubbing together underwater. "He is unwell." Caleb felt the familiar, cold urge to push through, to complete the mission. The law was on his side. It was his shield. "My business is with him," he said, his voice flat. "It concerns this land. I am Caleb Vane. I hold the title." He reached into his coat to produce the document, and the simple movement, so ordinary, made her flinch. It was not a flinch of fear for herself. It was something else, a protective, animalistic tension, the way a doe stiffens at the snap of a twig. She stepped off the porch, landing softly in the mud between him and the house. She was closer now. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair, and something else, the faint, sour scent of sickness that clung to the air near the cabin. "He is dying." The words were not a plea. They were a statement of fact, laid bare between them in the cold, damp air. They struck Caleb with more force than a physical blow. He froze, his hand still inside his coat, clutching the paper. "Dying." The word echoed in the fog, echoed in the hollows of his memory. He had seen a great deal of dying. He had sat with men as the light left their eyes in muddy fields and bloody hospital tents. He had never gotten used to it. He tried to hold his ground, to regather the armor of his purpose. "Ma'am, the law is clear. The debt was not paid. The bank—" "Please," she said, and now her voice broke. Just a little. The iron in her spine was bending, not yet broken. "I know what that paper says. I know why you are here. But he built this, with his hands. He and my mother. She is gone. He is all that is left. This place is all that is left of them." She glanced back at the cabin, and her gaze was so full of a fierce, painful love that Caleb found himself looking away. He looked at the poor, struggling fields, at the gray, indifferent sky that pressed down on them. "If you take it from him," she continued, her voice regaining its strength, "you will kill him. You will take the last breath from his body just as surely as if you put a pistol to his head." Caleb's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He hated this. He was not a killer, not anymore. He was a landowner. He was a man of order. This was disorder. This was emotion. This was the messy, painful reality of life that the law tried to pave over. "What do you expect me to do?" he wanted to shout. "Walk away. Forget the money I paid. Forget the new life I plan to build right here on this very spot." His silence was his answer. He was a hard man. He had to be. He had a duty to himself, to the law that was the only thing holding the world together. Rosalind saw the resolve in his face. She saw the man who had ridden through the fog to claim his prize, and she saw that he would not be turned aside by words. Her own face changed. The desperate plea faded, replaced by a strange, chilling calm. She had one thing left to bargain with. It was the only thing of value she possessed. The last thing any woman has. She took a half-step closer. Her eyes, which had been so full of fire, were now wide, clear, and utterly empty of hope. They were the eyes of someone walking into a fire, knowing they would be consumed. "Do not take the land," she whispered. Her voice was so low he had to lean his head forward to hear it. The fog seemed to draw in, wrapping them in a private, gray room, away from the watching window. Let him die here, in his own house, on his own land. It will not be long. I swear it. Caleb felt a muscle jump in his cheek. He had to end this, ma'am. I cannot just— "I will pay you," she said. He almost laughed. It would have been a bitter, harsh sound. He looked around at the barren farm, at the broken fence, at her patched dress. With what? She did not flinch. She did not look away. "Take me instead." Caleb Vane went utterly still. The world seemed to stop. The words did not make sense. They were just sounds in the fog. "Take me instead." He stared at her, searching her face for some sign of madness, of a cruel joke. He found none. He found only a terrifying, absolute sincerity. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You are a man," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion, as if reciting a list of goods. "You are alone. I am strong. I can work. I can cook. I can keep your house. I can be a wife to you. I will do what is required." She was offering him her body, her life, in exchange for a few weeks of dignity for a dying man. A wave of something hot and sour rose in Caleb's throat. It was revulsion. It was not for her. It was for the world, for the banks in Helena, for the law, for himself, for being the man standing here, in the mud. Listening to this, he felt stained. He felt like a party to something grotesque. He had come here to take possession of dirt, and he had been offered a human soul. He turned his back on her, a violent, sharp movement. He could not look at her. He could not see the pride he had admired just moments before, now broken and offered up for sale on the porch of a dying man's house. He put a hand on the wet porch rail, gripping it until his knuckles turned white. The fog swirled around his boots. He heard a single cough from inside the cabin, a dry, rattling sound that tore at the silence. It was the sound of a man drowning on dry land. He had come to take a piece of property. He had been offered a human life. The paper in his pocket felt like it was on fire. The crisp, legal document now seemed like the cruelest weapon he had ever carried. He remembered the arguments of his superiors in the war. The objective is what matters. The cost is secondary. He had believed that, once. But the cost was standing right behind him, breathing in the damp air, waiting for her new owner to accept the terms of the sale. He fought for control. He was Caleb Vane. He was a veteran. He was a landowner. He would not be this. He would not be the kind of man who bought people. Slowly, he turned back to her. Her hands were clasped at her waist, her body rigid. She was waiting. He would not acknowledge her offer. To speak of it would be to participate in it, to give it the dignity of consideration. "Your father," he said, his voice thick, rough, the sickness. "How long—" Rosalind's shoulders sagged, just slightly. The terrible tension of the offer still hung in the air between them, unanswered. But the question was a reprieve. The doctor from Sweetwater. He was here last week. He said the winter would take him, if he lasts that long. His lungs, they are failing. Caleb looked at the thin plume of smoke from the chimney. Winter. It was already autumn. The cold was in the air. A living thing. He was a man caught in a trap. If he took the land now, he was a monster, turning a dying man out of his home. If he accepted her offer, he was something far worse. And if he walked away, he lost everything he had paid for, the foundation of his new life. There was no right answer. There was only the least wrong one. "I will not—" He stopped. He would not enter the house. He would not force the issue. Not today. "I will make camp by the creek," he said, his voice hard. "The one down in the hollow? I need to see the boundaries." Rosalind looked at him, her face a mask of confusion. This was not acceptance. It was not refusal. It was nothing. "But you will not," she started, her voice trembling. "Afraid to hope." "You will not see him." "I will not see your father today," Caleb said, cutting her off. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low as if to shield himself from her gaze. She watched him, her mind struggling to understand. He was not leaving, but he was not staying. He was waiting, like a wolf, or perhaps like a man. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were small, fragile, almost lost in the fog. Caleb did not reply. He nodded, a sharp, curt gesture that was almost angry. He turned and walked away from her, his strides long, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. He felt her gaze on his back, a physical weight. He did not look back. He untied the bay, swung into the saddle, and kicked the horse into a walk. He rode away from the cabin, back into the gray embrace of the fog. He had come to claim his property, and in 5 minutes, he had found himself questioning the very meaning of the paper he held. The law was simple. Life, he was being reminded, was not. Caleb Vane did not run. He was not a man who ran, but he rode the bay with a controlled urgency, pushing through the thick, wet air as if he could outpace the words that followed him. "Take me instead." The fog swallowed the cabin behind him, but it could not swallow the echo of that whisper. It was in his head, in his chest, a sickening, cold weight. He found the creek in the hollow below the main house, just as the map had indicated. It was a narrow, sluggish ribbon of brown water, choked with fallen leaves. The trees, mostly cottonwoods and thin pines, crowded close, their branches dripping, their roots exposed like knotted veins in the muddy banks. It was a miserable place, a place to hunker down, not to build a home. It suited his mood perfectly. He dismounted and began the ritual of making camp. His hands, raw with the cold, moved with an efficiency that was instinctual. He unsaddled the bay, rubbed the horse down with a handful of dry grass, and tethered it where it could graze on the sparse, damp vegetation. He unrolled his bedroll, laying the oilcloth over a patch of ground that seemed slightly less saturated than the rest. He gathered wood, breaking dead branches from the underside of pines, his movements sharp, almost violent. He built a small fire, one that gave more smoke than heat, the damp wood hissing and popping in protest. Through all of it, his mind was not on the tasks. It was on the porch, on her. He tried to tell himself she was bluffing, that it was a wild, desperate gambit from a girl who had no other cards to play. But he could not make himself believe it. He had seen her eyes. They were not the eyes of a liar. They were the eyes of a martyr, a soul that had calculated the cost and agreed to pay it. She would have done it. She would have walked into his camp, into his life, and become whatever he demanded. All to keep the rattle in her father's chest from being the last sound he heard in his own home. A memory, ugly and unwelcome. Surfaced from the war, a town in the border states, burned out, starving. He and his squad had been on patrol. A woman, not much older than Rosalind, had approached their captain. She had 2 small, hollow-eyed children hiding in her skirts. She had offered herself to the entire squad. For a side of bacon, the captain, a decent man, had turned her away gently. But Caleb had seen the look in her eyes. It was the same look, the same terrible, hollowed-out willingness, the same complete and total sacrifice. He had thought, when he left the war, when he came west, that he was leaving that world behind. A world where people were forced into choices that were not choices at all. He had come here, with his legal paper, to be part of something clean, the law, order, a place where a man's property was his, where things were simple and clear. He had believed in the paper. It was his gospel. Now, That paper felt like a cudgel. That paper had driven that girl to the same desperate place as the starving woman in the burned-out town. He, Caleb Vane, who had fought to stop a nation from breaking apart, was here breaking this one small family. He had become the conqueror. He was the man with the power, and she was the vanquished, offering the only thing she had left. The revulsion he had felt on the porch returned, colder and sharper. He felt dirty. He sat on his bedroll, staring into the smoky, struggling fire. He was not a man who wavered. He had been given objectives, and he had taken them. He had been ordered to hold lines, and he had held them. His jaw was set. His will was iron. He had survived because he was hard. But this was a different kind of hardness. This was not the hardness of a soldier. This was the hardness of a predator. As the day wore on, the fog did not burn off, but it shifted. It lifted, like a great gray curtain being raised just high enough for him to see the stage from his camp in the hollow. He could now see the cabin. It was small and dark on the rise above him, a smudge of human hope against the vast, indifferent landscape. It was his house. The thought gave him no satisfaction. It felt, instead, like a burden. He watched the house. He was surveying his property, he told himself, getting the lay of the land, but he knew he was lying. He was watching them. He was laying siege. A silent, one-man army. He was waiting for his enemy to die. Late in the afternoon, he saw movement at the window. He had been watching the door, half expecting, half dreading that Rosalind would appear, walking down the hill, coming to. What reaffirmed her offer he did not know, but the movement was not at the door. It was at the window. The silhouette, the old man, Jeremiah Dunn. He was standing there, just as he had been when Caleb first rode up. He was leaning heavily on the window frame. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the frailty, the paper-thin quality of the man. He was barely there, a ghost already, haunting his own home. He was looking out, not at Caleb's camp, which was likely hidden by the lip of the hollow, but just out, looking at the land, his land. Caleb watched him for a long time. The man did not move, beyond the occasional tremor that shook his frame. He just stood and looked. What was he seeing? Was he seeing the fields as they were, choked and barren? Or was he seeing them as they had been, full of wheat? Was he remembering the day he cut the first log for that cabin? Was he remembering his wife? A profound, suffocating guilt settled on Caleb. This was the man. This was the father Rosalind Dunn was willing to trade her life for. A dying man, standing his last post, looking over the world he had built with his own 2 hands. A world Caleb was here to take from him. The man had not paid his debt. The bank had a right. Caleb had a right. The law was clear. But the law was blind. The law did not see the man in the window. The law did not see the desperation in the daughter's eyes. The law saw only ink on paper. Caleb, for the first time in his life, found himself hating the law. He pulled the paper from his coat. It was stiff, damp at the edges. He unfolded it. He read the words again. Caleb Vane, legal owner. Section 4, Township 8. It was his. This was his start. This was the reward for all the blood and mud he had waded through. This was his payment for the friends he had buried, for the parts of himself he had lost. He had earned this. He had paid for it. His mind, the practical, disciplined part of him, screamed at him, "You are a fool. You are letting a woman's tears undo you. Take the land. It is yours. Their plight is not your doing. You are not responsible for his sickness or their debt. You walk away from this, you lose everything. You are a landowner. Act like one." He looked up from the paper to the house on the hill. The old man was gone from the window. The house looked empty, dark. He thought of Rosalind inside, tending to her father, giving him water, listening to his failing breath. Did she hate him, Caleb Vane? The man in the fog, the man who had come to take everything. Yes, she had to, And yet she had offered herself to him. The thought was a new kind of torture. She would hate him, and she would submit to him, and the combination of the two was a sin he did not know how to name. He was torn. His reason, his logic, his entire plan for his future was at war with something else. A feeling. He hated feelings. They were weaknesses. They were the things that got men killed. Compassion, mercy. He had seen them as liabilities. But now, sitting by his smoky fire, he felt his own hardness as a sickness. His legal right felt like a moral wrong. He could not force them out. He could not with the old man dying. He would be no better than the men who had burned farms and left families to starve. But he could not walk away. He could not give up his claim. It was all he had. The fog began to thicken again, the gray light of evening fading. Caleb sat in the cold, a man trapped between his own past and a future he no longer understood. He had come to take a piece of land, and he had found himself in a battle for his own soul. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. It felt heavy as lead. He would wait. He would wait for the winter. He would wait for death. He was a soldier again, after all, laying siege. 3 days passed. The fog had drawn back, like an army retreating to the mountain tops, leaving the world sharp and cold. A brittle autumn sun shone, but it offered no warmth. It just illuminated the land's poverty, the way the frost clung to the brown grass, the starkness of the bare cottonwood branches. Caleb Vane remained in the hollow, a man in a self-imposed purgatory. He had spent the days methodically walking the boundaries of the property, his property. The survey map was correct. The creek was his. The sorry patch of woods was his. The rising slope of the hill was his. The cabin, with its plume of smoke, sat squarely in the middle of his land. He found the fences. They were worse than he had first thought. On the north line, a whole section was down, the rails rotted, the posts pushed over, likely by lean cattle drifting through. The soil was thin, rocky. He dug his hands into it, letting the cold, clumpy dirt run through his fingers. It was poor land. It would take years of back-breaking work to make it yield anything worthwhile. Years, like the ones Jeremiah Dunn had already poured into it. He saw her, Rosalind, twice, both times from a distance. Once, she was chopping wood by the side of the house. Her movements were strong, rhythmic, but he could see the weariness in her shoulders even from 100 yards. She did not have the build for it, but she had the will. She was fighting the coming winter with every swing of the axe. The second time, she was carrying 2 heavy buckets of water up from the well, leaning against the weight, her head down. She never looked toward his camp. She knew he was there. Her awareness of him was a tangible thing, a line drawn tight between the hollow and the house. But she did not acknowledge him. Her terrible offer still lay between them, unspoken, unanswered, a rotting carcass in the clean, cold air. He could not continue this silent, cowardly waiting. He was not a vulture, waiting for death. He was a man, and the man he had come to displace deserved to see his face. He owed him that. He owed it to himself, to be a soldier with a mission, not a skulker in the trees. On the morning of the 4th day, he saddled the bay and rode up the hill. He did not go to the front. He rode to the back, to the lean-to where she had been chopping the wood. He dismounted, tied his horse to a post, and walked around to the porch. She was there, as if she had sensed him. She was sweeping the porch with a worn broom, her movements as useless as they were defiant. When she saw him, she stopped. Her face went pale. She held the broom across her body like a weapon. "No," she said, her voice low. "Please, he is having a hard day." "I am not here to move him," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new resolve. "I am here to speak to him, man to man." She searched his face, looking for the legal, cold man of 3 days prior. He was still there, but something else was, too, a weariness that matched her own, a reluctance. "I will not have you trouble him," she said. It is more trouble to have me sitting in his hollow like a shadow. He knows I am here. Let me face him." Before she could protest again, the door creaked open. "Let him in, girl." The voice was a dry rasp, like stones scraping in a riverbed. "Let him in. I want to see the man who thinks a piece of paper is stronger than a man's life." Rosalind's shoulders fell. She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for her father. She stepped aside, holding the door open. Caleb took a deep breath of the cold air, then stepped past her, out of the weak sunlight and into the gloom of the cabin. It was one room. The air was thick, oppressive, smelling of boiled herbs, old smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of advanced sickness. A small fire in the hearth provided the only real light, throwing shadows that danced on the rough log walls. A cot was in the far corner, unmade, but the man was not in it. Jeremiah Dunn was seated in a high-backed wooden chair near the fire. A collection of threadbare blankets pooled in his lap. He was thinner than Caleb could have imagined. His skin was like yellowed parchment, stretched tight over the bones of his face. His hair was white and thin, but his eyes were alive. They were a pale, burning blue, and they fixed on Caleb with an intensity that was startling. Caleb stopped in the center of the room. He did not remove his hat. This was not a social call. Rosalind moved to stand by the hearth, her hands twisting in her apron, her gaze flickering between the two men. "Mr. Dunn," Caleb began, his voice sounding too loud in the small, still room. "My name is Caleb Vane." "I know your name," the old man rasped, lifting one gnarled hand from the blanket. "I know your business. You are the bank's new dog, come to claim the bone." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I am no man's dog. I bought this land. Legally, I have the title." "Title?" Jeremiah scoffed. The sound turned into a racking cough that shook his entire body. Rosalind started to move toward him, but he waved her back with an angry, weak gesture. He spat into a rag by his chair. "Title. You show me paper. I show you my hands." He held them up. They were claws, twisted by work and inflammation, the knuckles swollen, the skin scarred. "These hands," he whispered, but his voice filled the room. "These hands pulled the stone for that chimney. These hands cut the logs for these walls. These hands broke that poor, stubborn ground out there. My wife, my Mary, she worked beside me. She bled into this land. She is buried on that hill, under the big pine. That is my title. Her body is my deed. You think your piece of paper from a fat man in Helena means more than that." Caleb stood rigid. The man's words were a physical assault. He felt the weight of every log, every stone, every drop of sweat. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said, glancing at Rosalind. "And I am sorry for your trouble, Mr. Dunn. But the law—" "The law," Jeremiah spat. "The law is a tool for rich men to take from poor men. The law is a thief in a fine coat. I owed the bank. A bad year, 2 bad years. No rain. My wife took sick. The doctor cost money. I could not pay both. So I paid the man who tried to save her. I would do it again. Now, you come to take it all." He leaned forward, his burning eyes pinning Caleb. "So, take it, Mr. Vane. Go on, put your hands on me. Drag this dying body out of my chair, out of my house. Throw me in the mud. Let me die out there, so you can sleep warm in here. Do it. Show me what kind of man the law makes." The challenge hung in the air, vibrating with a desperate, prideful fury. Rosalind let out a small, choked sob, her hand covering her mouth. Caleb looked at the old man. He saw the stubborn pride, the unbreakable will that had carved this place out of nothing. He saw a man who had already lost everything that mattered, his wife, his health, his future. All he had left was this one room, this one chair, and his own defiance. And Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled in his stomach like a cold stone, that he could not do it. He could not be the man who raised a hand to this shadow. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. The old man's labored breathing was a painful rhythm in the background. Caleb's throat was dry. He had faced down men with rifles, men with knives. He had never faced this. This was a man with no weapons, and he was invincible. Caleb's logic, his reason, his legal right, all shattered against the simple, terrible fact of this man's humanity. The guilt he had felt in the hollow was nothing compared to this. This was a raw, open shame. He was the villain in this story. The paper in his coat was a warrant for a crime, not a deed for a property. He looked at Rosalind. She was watching him, her face wet with tears. But her eyes, they were not just afraid. They were pleading with him to be merciful. But he also saw something else. She was looking at him as if she was seeing him for the first time, not as a bank man, not as a threat, but as a man who was being tested. He turned his gaze back to Jeremiah. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a surrender. It was not an agreement. It was an acknowledgement of him, of his fight, of his pain. "You have had your say," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He turned, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and walked out. He did not look at Rosalind as he passed her. He stepped out onto the porch, into the cold, bright air, and it felt like coming up from underwater. He gasped, pulling the clean air into his lungs, trying to wash out the smell of sickness and death. He was halfway to his horse when he heard the door open again. "Mr. Vane." He stopped, but he did not turn. It was her. He is proud," she said, her voice trembling. "He did not mean, he is just so afraid of dying. Anywhere else." Caleb stood, his back to her, looking at the poor, brown land, his land. "He is a strong man," Caleb said, the words surprising him. He turned to face her. She was standing on the porch, hugging herself against the cold, her face a mess of tears and dirt and exhaustion. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a body to be bargained for, not as a victim, but as a woman with a spine of pure steel, holding her entire world together with her bare, cracked hands. He saw an inner beauty that was so profound, so real. It made the fashionable women of the East seem like pale, paper dolls. It was the beauty of absolute loyalty, the beauty of sacrifice. This realization made his decision harder, not easier. To enforce his claim now was not just to fight a dying man. It was to crush this, to break this rare, fierce spirit. Before he could stop himself, he nodded toward the north. "The fence line is down. Your cow will drift." Rosalind wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Leaving a streak of mud, I know. I will get to it, when I can." Caleb just looked at her. He knew she could not. He knew the ground would be frozen solid by the end of the week. He knew she had to choose between chopping firewood, tending her father, and mending a fence she did not have the strength to mend. He said nothing else. He mounted his horse as he rode away, back to his cold, lonely camp. The image of her face and the sound of her father's defiant breathing went with him. The guilt was no longer a shadow. It was a companion, sitting beside him at his fire, asking him questions he could not answer. The night after his meeting with Jeremiah, Caleb did not sleep. He sat by his fire, listening to the world grow colder. The wind had a new, sharp edge, a promise of the hard winter to come. He was a man suspended. He could not go forward, and he could not go back. His legal right was a stone in his pocket, and his conscience was a stone in his gut. He spent the next day in a restless, angry inertia. He was a man built for action, for solving problems with his hands or his will. This was a problem with no solution. He found himself walking the north fence line again, the one he had mentioned to Rosalind. The rot was deep in the rails. It was not a simple repair. It would take new posts, new rails. It would take days of work on land that was his but was not, work for a family that saw him as an enemy. He was wrestling with a rotted post, pulling it from the hard, cold ground with a grunt, when he heard the rider. He dropped the post and his hand went to his pistol, his body dropping into a soldier's crouch. He had been so lost in his thoughts, in the physical labor, that he had let someone get close. He cursed himself. He was soft. The rider was coming from the east, from the direction of the town of Sweetwater. He was not on a workhorse. He was on a fine, high-stepping gelding. And he was not dressed for the wilderness. He wore a dark wool suit, a waistcoat, and a fine hat. He rode as if he owned the horse, the land, and the very air he breathed. Caleb stood, his hand still resting on the grip of his pistol. The rider saw him and raised a gloved hand, a bright, false smile splitting his face. "Well now, cousin, I was wondering where you had got to. Playing farmer already. I see." The man pulled his horse to a halt. He was older than Caleb, perhaps 40. His face was smooth, almost unlined, but his eyes were small, quick, and missed nothing. This was Morgan Vane, Caleb's cousin, the man who had found him in Helena, who had told him about this opportunity, the man who had put up half the money. "Morgan," Caleb said. He did not smile. He did not walk forward. "What are you doing here?" Morgan Vane dismounted, his movements fluid, easy. He took a kerchief from his pocket and fastidiously wiped the dust from his fine black boots. "I am here, my dear boy, to see about our investment. I got your wire saying you had arrived. That was a week ago. I expected by now you would be, well, more comfortably settled." He gestured to Caleb's small, smoky camp in the hollow, a look of mild disgust on his face. "They are still here," Caleb said, his voice flat. Morgan's smile did not falter, but his eyes went cold. "Still here, I see, and you are camping on the creek, like a hired hand." He looked up at the cabin on the rise. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the chimney. "They are burning our wood. I see." Caleb felt a low, protective anger. "It is cold." Morgan laughed. A short, barking sound. "Of course it is cold. It is Montana, in autumn. That is why our buyer in Helena is so very eager to close. He wants the timber rights before the snows shut the passes. You know this." "I have run into a complication," Caleb said. Morgan Vane looked at him, the smile gone completely now. "A complication? Do not tell me. Let me guess. The woman." He gestured toward the cabin. "I saw her from the road. A fine-looking, stubborn piece of—" "That is enough, Morgan." Morgan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Forgive me. I forget your sensibilities. So it is not the woman. Then what?" "The old man, her father. He is in the house. He is dying." Morgan stared at Caleb for a long moment, as if he had just been told a mildly amusing joke. "Dying. Well, people do that. It is a sad fact of life. What, precisely, does that have to do with our business?" Caleb felt the gap between them widen. A chasm. "He is dying. Morgan, he built the place. He wants to die in his own house." Morgan sighed, as if explaining a simple sum to a difficult child. "Caleb, listen to me. That house is not his. That house is ours. That land, that timber, that creek, it is all ours. We paid for it. We have the paper. That old man's sentimental wishes are not our concern. Our concern is the man in Helena who is waiting to pay us 5 times what we put in." "He is not just a squatter," Caleb said, his voice low. "He is a man." "And we are businessmen," Morgan countered, his voice sharp. "Cutting. Or at least, I am. I thought you were the hard man, the veteran, the man who got things done. That is what I told our partners. I told them, my cousin Caleb, he is not a soft man. He will not let a little unpleasantness get in the way of progress." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That buyer, he is not just some timberman. He has friends. He has plans for this whole valley, this little patch of dirt. This is the key. He gets this. He gets the water rights. He gets this. He can pressure the others. We are not just buying a farm, Caleb. We are buying a future. Our future. And you are letting a coughing old man and his girl stand in the way of it." Morgan's words were a twisted echo of Caleb's own thoughts. The objective, the mission. But hearing it from Morgan's lips, it all sounded sour, rotten with a greed Caleb had not wanted to see in himself. He had told himself this was about law, about order. Morgan was making it clear it was about profit. Only profit. Just then, they both heard the sharp thwack of an axe. They looked up. Rosalind was at the woodpile. She was struggling to split a thick, knotted log. She raised the heavy axe, her body straining, and brought it down. The axe head bounced off the knot with a dull thunk. She stumbled, catching her balance. She did not stop. She rested a moment, her chest heaving, and raised the axe again. She was fighting a losing battle against the coming cold. Morgan watched her, a thin smile on his lips. "She is a stubborn one. You can see it. That is the problem with these people. They think their sweat is worth more than our money." He looked at Caleb. "She is on your land. Caleb, burning your trees." "Let her be," Caleb said, his voice a low warning. Morgan's eyes widened. "Oh, cousin. Oh, no, do not tell me. You have let this girl get under your skin. The oldest trick in the book. A pretty face. A sad story. You are a fool." Before Caleb could answer, Morgan turned to his horse. "I am riding to Sweetwater. I have, other business. I will be back in 2 days. 2 days." He held up 2 gloved fingers. "When I return, I expect that cabin to be empty. If it is not, I am riding to Helena, and I am getting the sheriff. And I will tell our buyer exactly who is holding up this deal. Do not make me do that. Caleb, do not make me choose between my cousin and my future." He swung into his saddle, a man in perfect control. He looked down at Caleb, his face hard, all pretense of charm gone. "You are a soldier. Caleb, this is your objective. Take it." Morgan wheeled his horse and set off at a smart trot, disappearing back the way he had come, leaving Caleb standing by the rotted fence line, the cold promise of an ultimatum settling over him. The sun went down. The world became shades of gray and black. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in from the darkness. Caleb sat by his fire, the paper in his hand. He was trapped. Morgan had called his bluff. In 2 days, the law would come. The law, which he had believed in, would be a tool in Morgan Vane's hand. And he, Caleb, would be a party to it. He would stand by and watch the sheriff drag a dying man from his home. The thought made him sick. He heard the sound, the snap of a frozen twig, and was on his feet in an instant, his pistol in his hand, his body coiled. A figure was standing just at the edge of the firelight. A shadow. "Who is there?" he called out, his voice sharp. "Mr. Vane." The voice was small, trembling. It was Rosalind. He lowered the pistol, his heart hammering in his chest. A wild, terrible thought seized him, that she was here, that she had come to. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "Get back to the house. It is not safe." I saw that man today, the one in the fine suit. He rode up to the house." Caleb went still. Did he bother you?" She shivered, though she was standing near the fire. "No, not rightly. He just looked at me." He smiled. He said to enjoy my last few nights of warmth. He is not like you, Mr. Vane." The words, so simple, struck Caleb with the force of a blow. He is not like you. She saw it. She saw the difference. She stepped forward, her hand held out. She was carrying a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like a clean rag. I cannot. Please, she whispered. She held it out to him. "You have been here. It has been almost a week. You spoke to my father. You did not. You left him in peace. I have nothing to pay. Caleb stared at the bundle, horrified. Is that what you think this is? No, she said, and for the first time, he saw a flash of her father's pride, her father's anger. This is not that, this is bread and salt pork. You are a man. You must be hungry. He looked at her, truly stunned. He was her enemy, the man who was, in 2 days, going to take her home, and she had walked through the dark, cold night, past a man she was afraid of, to bring him supper. He slowly, dumbly, reached out and took the bundle from her. It was warm. His large, rough fingers brushed against hers. Her hand was small, trembling, and as cold as ice. The touch was a jolt, a sudden, sharp connection in the vast, cold darkness. He looked from the bundle to her face. The firelight was kind to her. It softened the lines of exhaustion, the shadows under her eyes. It illuminated the profound, defiant strength that he had seen from the first moment, the inner beauty he had glimpsed in the cabin. He cleared his throat, his voice thick. You should not have come. I know. She was looking at the ground now, as if ashamed. I must go back. He will wake. Wait. The word was out before he could stop it. Your fence, the north line. She nodded, her face tight with a familiar pain. I know. I do not have the time. The wood for the fire. And Papa. You will lose your cow, he said, not unkindly. I know, she whispered, and her voice broke. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. I know, I cannot do it all. He stood there, the warm bread in his hand, a war raging inside him. Morgan, the sheriff, the dying man, and this woman, this impossible woman, who brought food to her enemy. Go, he said, his voice rough. Go back to the house, and bolt your door. She looked at him, a long, searching look, as if she was trying to see past the shadows on his face, trying to find the man inside. Then she turned, and like a ghost, she was gone, swallowed by the night. Caleb stood alone by the fire. He slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a thick heel of dark, coarse bread, still warm, and 2 thin slices of salt pork. It was, he knew, a sacrifice. She was giving him food she and her father could not spare. He looked up at the house on the hill, then back down at the offering in his hand. The law was the law, but this was something else. The bread was gone. Caleb Vane had eaten it before the fire was cold, his hunger a hollow ache that the small, dense offering could not fill. He had eaten her sacrifice, and with it, he had swallowed a new, unfamiliar resolve. He was a man of action, and he had been paralyzed for a week. He had waited for death, for law, for something to happen. No more. He spent the next day, the last day of Morgan's ultimatum, not in his camp, but on the North Slope. He did not pack. He did not ride to Sweetwater to meet his cousin. He took his axe, which was sharp, and his rope, which was strong, and he began to mend the fence. It was brutal, numbing work. The ground was hard, frozen in the top inches. He had to chip at it, his hands already raw from the cold, to dig new post holes. He used his axe to cut new rails from a stand of young pine, the sound of his work echoing in the cold, clear air. It was a soldier's work, a practical task. He told himself it was just to keep the single, bony cow from wandering off. He told himself it was an owner's right to improve his property, but he knew, with every swing of the axe, with every shovelful of cold earth, that he was lying. He was not improving his property. He was defending hers. He saw her twice. She came to the woodpile, her movements small and furtive, like a deer. She watched him. He was 100 yards away, stripped to his shirt despite the cold, steam rising from his back. He did not stop. He did not wave. He just worked. He saw her confusion, the way she tilted her head, unable to understand why the wolf at her door was suddenly mending the sheep pen. She went back inside. Later, around noon, she came out again. She walked a few yards into the open, her hands clasped. He stopped, leaning on his axe handle, wiping the sweat from his face with his sleeve. They were too far to talk. She just stood there, watching him. He gave a single, curt nod, then turned back to his work, sinking a new post into the hard ground. He felt her eyes on him for a long time before she retreated back to the cabin. He worked until the sun was a cold, red smear in the west, painting the undersides of the high, thin clouds. The fence was not beautiful. It was a scar of new, pale wood against the old, gray rot. But it was strong. The line was secure. He was finished. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming, his hands bleeding. But the cold stone in his gut, the guilt, the shame, it was gone. He was just a man, tired from a long day's work. He gathered his tools and walked back to his camp in the twilight. He was rubbing down the bay when he heard them. Horses, more than one, coming fast from the east. Caleb Vane did not crouch. He did not reach for his pistol. He just stood, his hand on the bay's neck, and waited. He knew who it was. The ultimatum was over. 2 riders crested the low hill and rode down into the hollow. The first was Morgan Vane, his face a tight, angry mask in the gloom. The second man was older, with a thick mustache and a star pinned to his coat. He wore the tired, neutral expression of the law. Morgan reined his horse in hard, sending gravel skittering. "Well, cousin, I see you are still here. I see the cabin is still occupied. You have failed to complete the simplest of tasks." Caleb just looked at him. Morgan's lip curled. "I knew you would. I knew you had gone soft. That is why I brought Sheriff Brody." The sheriff nodded at Caleb. "Mr. Vane, I am Sheriff Brody from Sweetwater. I have a writ here, a legal order of eviction for one Jeremiah Dunn and all other occupants, to be removed from this property." He pulled a paper from his coat. "It is registered to you. Is that correct? You are the owner." "I am," Caleb said. His voice was quiet. "And you wish to have these people removed?" the sheriff asked, his gaze steady. Before Caleb could answer, Morgan cut in, his voice sharp and loud. "Meant to carry, of course he does. Sheriff, we are businessmen. These squatters are costing us money. My cousin is a man of the law. He wants this done legally. That is why you are here." The shouting had an immediate effect. The cabin door, up on the hill, flew open. Rosalind ran out onto the porch. She was silhouetted against the weak light from the cabin's single window. "No," she cried out, her voice thin with panic. "No, please." Morgan Vane smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. "You see, Sheriff, they are defiant. You will have to drag them out." Sheriff Brody sighed. He hated this. He looked up the hill. "Mr. Dunn, this is the sheriff. I have a court order. You need to come out." A long, hacking cough was the only answer. Morgan was bristling with impatience. He turned his horse, bumping it against Caleb's. "End this, Caleb. Tell the sheriff. Tell him to do his job. Or are you going to throw away everything our future? The money, the respect. All for a dying old man and a girl who is probably laughing at you." Caleb said nothing. He stared at his cousin. "You are a fool," Morgan hissed, his voice low and vicious. "I told them you were a hard man. I told them you were a soldier. You are not. You are a weakling. You are letting a piece of calico undo you. You do this. You are finished. You will not get another dollar from me or from anyone in Helena. You will be a broke, wandering nobody. You will be nothing." Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Vane, I need your word. Do you want them out? It is your property. The law is on your side." Caleb was trapped. The law he had revered was a gun to his head. The man he called family was his enemy. He looked up the hill. Rosalind was running. She was not running to the sheriff. She was not running away. She was running down the hill toward them, her feet stumbling on the frozen, uneven ground. She did not stop until she was standing right in the middle of the hollow, in the dying light, her chest heaving, her face a mask of pale terror. She ignored the sheriff. She ignored Morgan. She looked only at Caleb. "Mr. Vane!" she panted, her voice desperate. Morgan laughed. A short, ugly sound. "What is this? Has she come to beg?" Caleb's gaze was locked on her. He saw her face. She was not just afraid. She was resolved. She was about to do the last, most desperate thing she could. She was about to play her only card. "Mr. Vane, Caleb," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, though it carried in the cold. "Still air, please. I made you an offer. I told you I would." Caleb's blood ran cold. He knew what she was doing. She was about to offer herself, here, in front of these men. "I will honor it," she said, her voice breaking, thick with a shame that was so profound it was almost holy. I will be yours. I will sign whatever you want. I will go with you. Now, I will leave him. Just let him die in his bed. Please, I am begging you. Let him have that. Take me." It was done. The words were out, hanging in the air. Morgan Vane's jaw dropped. He stared at her, then at Caleb, and then he let out a great, whooping laugh of pure, astonished greed. "Well, I will be damned, she is offering herself to you a trade." He laughed again, wiping a tear from his eye. "Cousin, you are a master. You play a deeper game than I ever knew." He looked at the sheriff. "Well, this is a fine turn of events. He gets the land and the girl." The sheriff's face was stone. He looked away, disgusted. "Ma'am." Caleb looked at Rosalind. He saw the tracks of her tears, stark in the twilight. He saw her shame, but beneath it, he saw what he had seen from the first. He saw the iron. He saw the unconditional love for her father, a love so powerful she would walk into hell for it, would offer her body and her soul to a man she barely knew. He saw a sacrifice so pure it made Morgan's talk of money and futures seem like the chattering of a monkey. She had trusted him. In her desperation, she had offered herself to him, the man who mended her fence, not the man who leered at her. She had seen a difference between them. She had, in her own way, chosen him, and in that instant, Caleb Vane chose her. All the conflict, all the guilt, all the law and the profit, it all vaporized. There was only this one brave, broken, beautiful thing. He dismounted, his movements fluid, calm. He stepped in front of Rosalind, putting his body between her and his cousin. He turned his back to her, facing Morgan and the sheriff. "Sheriff," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the cold air with absolute authority. "There has been a mistake." Morgan's smile vanished. "Caleb, what in the hell are you doing?" "This is my property," Caleb said, his eyes on the sheriff. "That is true. And as the legal owner, I am inviting Mr. Dunn and his daughter to stay." Rosalind let out a small, broken sound behind him, a gasp of pure disbelief. "What?" Morgan shrieked, his voice cracking. "Insane! You are insane! You are letting them stay!" Caleb did not look at him. He looked at the sheriff. "They are my tenants, as of this moment." Sheriff Brody held his ground, but the tightness around his eyes eased. He looked at the writ in his hand, then at Caleb. "Mr. Vane, your cousin here, he has the writ. A writ of eviction for squatters." "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice cold and precise, "these are not squatters. They are tenants, by my personal invitation. A tenancy agreement is a civil matter. I believe it does not concern you." The sheriff almost smiled. He folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "You are right, Mr. Vane. A tenancy dispute is a civil matter. It has nothing to do with me." He looked at Morgan. "Unless you have a different court order." You bastard!" Morgan screamed, his face a blotchy purple in the dusk. "You worthless, spineless, weak, you are throwing it all away for her." He was choking on his rage. Caleb said, "Sheriff, this man, Morgan Vane, he is trespassing on my land. I want him gone." The sheriff nodded, settling his hat. "Mr. Morgan Vane, you heard the owner. This is private property. He wants you to leave." Morgan stared at Caleb, his eye slits of pure, venomous hatred. "This is not over. You hear me, our partners in Helena. The money I am owed. You will pay for this. I will ruin you. I will see you." "Get off my land, Morgan," Caleb said. For a moment, Morgan looked like he might draw his gun. He was vibrating with fury, but he saw the look in Caleb's eyes, the look of a soldier, the look of a man who had made his choice and would not be moved. Morgan spat on the ground. He yanked his horse's head around, the animal rearing in protest. "You chose them," he screamed. "You chose this mud. You will die here. You hear me? You will die here, broke and alone, just like that old man." He kicked his horse into a gallop, fleeing up the hill and into the darkness, a man consumed by his own greed. The sound of his hoofbeats faded. The hollow was silent, save for the wind in the pines and the sound of Rosalind weeping softly, desperately behind Caleb. Caleb turned to the sheriff. "Thank you for your time." "Sheriff." Sheriff Brody touched the brim of his hat. He looked at Caleb with a new respect. "Mr. Vane." He nodded to the girl. "Ma'am." He turned his horse and rode away at a steady walk, a man more than happy to leave this mess behind. Caleb was alone with her. He turned. She was on her knees, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. He waited. He did not touch her. After a long moment, she looked up. Her face was a ruin, but her eyes were wide with a new, terrifying, fragile hope. What did you do?" she whispered. He felt a wave of exhaustion, so profound he almost staggered. He looked at the cabin, then back at her. My offer," she stammered, trying to get to her feet. I will." Caleb took a step toward her. "We will never," he said, his voice rough, full of a new, hard-edged protection. "We will never speak of that again. Do you understand me? Never." "But the land, your cousin, the money, you—" "My cousin is gone. The land is mine, and you and your father, you are staying as your tenants," she whispered, finally standing. Caleb looked at the light in the window. He heard Jeremiah cough again. "Yes, as my tenants." He turned and walked to his horse. "Where are you going?" she cried, a new panic in her voice. He swung into the saddle. He was sore from his work, drained from the confrontation. He looked down at her, a small, strong figure in the vast darkness. "I am riding to Sweetwater," he said. "But your cousin, I have to register the tenancy agreement with the land office," he said, "to make it legal, to make sure he can never use the law against you again." He nudged the bay into a walk, riding out of the hollow, leaving her standing in the cold, watching him go. He was the man who had come to take her land. He was the man who had just mended her fence. And he was the man who was now riding through the night to use the very law he had struggled with, to save her. The ride to Sweetwater had been long, the wind a constant, sharp presence at his back. The town was little more than a single muddy street, a general store, a saloon, and the land office. The man inside the office had been small, with wire spectacles and a dusty coat. He had looked at Caleb with a flat, neutral gaze. Even as Caleb paid the fee to register the tenancy agreement, the clerk had stamped the paper, copied it into his ledger, and handed Caleb his copy. It was done. It was legal. It was a shield, forged from the very paper that had once been his sword. Caleb Vane rode back not as a landowner, but as a guardian. He had left his camp in the hollow. He had not told Rosalind he was leaving, But he knew she would see his horse was gone, his bedroll packed. He did not know what she would think. He did not know what he would say when he returned. He only knew that the confrontation with Morgan was not over. It was just beginning. He had won the legal skirmish. The war, he knew, was still to come. Morgan Vane was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who escalated. He rode the bay slowly, letting the horse pick its way over the frozen, uneven trail. The sun was low, casting long, purple shadows from the high pines. The world was cold, silent. He had the new, stamped agreement in his breast pocket, replacing the writ of ownership he had first carried. That original deed was in his saddlebag. He had given up the immediate profit, the partnership, the entire future Morgan had laid out. He had chosen instead this patch of poor land, this family of strangers. He had chosen it not for the law, but in spite of the law. He had chosen it because of a woman's desperate plea, because of a dying man's pride, because of a piece of warm bread offered in the dark. He had acted from a place inside himself he thought the war had burned away, a place of simple, hard compassion. He was halfway back, in a narrow pass where the trail cut between high banks of stone and pine, when he knew he was not alone. The bay felt it first, its ears flattening, its step faltering. It blew out a nervous breath. Caleb reined in, his hand moving not to his pistol, but just resting on his thigh. He sat still, scanning the woods above him. The shadows were deep. "Good evening, cousin." Morgan Vane's voice was light, almost pleasant. He stepped out from behind a large boulder. Not 10 yards ahead, he was not dressed for the wilderness. He still wore his fine wool suit, though it was now rumpled. He was smiling. Caleb sat his horse, his face hard. "Morgan." "You have been a busy man," Morgan said, stepping onto the trail, riding to town, filing papers, making arrangements. It was all very public, very foolish. "It is done," Caleb said, his voice low. "It is legal. They are my tenants. You cannot touch them." Morgan laughed. It was not the short, barking laugh of before. It was a low, genuinely amused sound. "Legal. You do love that word. You think your little piece of paper in the Sweetwater office means anything. You think it stops me." "It stops the sheriff," Caleb said. Morgan's smile widened. "We are a long way from the sheriff, are we not?" He looked around the empty twilight pass. No one for miles. No one to hear you. No one to see what happens. "What happens, Morgan?" "Why, you change your mind," Morgan said. He took a small, folded paper from his own pocket. "A bill of sale. You have decided that this land, this miserable patch of dirt, is not for you after all. You have decided to sell it. To me. For the very generous sum of $1. Caleb stared at him. "And if I refuse?" Morgan sighed. A theatrical gesture of disappointment. "Caleb, you are still thinking like a soldier. You are not thinking like a businessman. A businessman knows when he is beaten. He knows when to cut his losses. He knows how to accept a new deal. And I am offering you a new deal." Two men stepped out of the woods behind Morgan. They were not businessmen. They were hard, rough men. The kind who haunted the back rooms of saloons. The kind who did jobs for men like Morgan. One was large, a heavy, bearish man with a tangled beard. The other was thin, with a long scar down one side of his face. Neither of them was smiling. Morgan gestured to them. "These are associates. They are here to witness our transaction, to make sure you sign." "They want the land," Caleb said, his gaze steady on his cousin. "The men in Helena. They will not be stopped by a tenancy agreement." "They will not," Morgan agreed, his voice turning ice cold. "They want their timber, they want their water, and I want my money. You have cost me a fortune. You have humiliated me. You have stood against your own blood for that," he spat the word. "That girl, that house of sickness." He stepped closer, his face twisting in a mask of rage. I offered you a future. I offered you wealth. And you chose them. You chose poverty. It is my land, Caleb said. They are my people. Morgan's face went purple. His people. You have known them a week. They are nothing. They are dirt. And you are a fool. He nodded to the two men. Persuade him. Get the deed from his saddlebag. He wants to be a hero. Show him what happens to heroes. The big bearded man moved first. He lunged for the bay's bridle, his hand a meaty paw. The horse shied, rearing, its eyes wide. The man held on, dragging its head down. The thin man, Scarface, moved at the same time, circling to Caleb's right, his hand reaching inside his coat. Caleb moved. He was not a brawler. He was a soldier. He did not fight with wild, swinging punches. He fought to end a threat. As the horse came down, Caleb kicked his left foot free of the stirrup and swung his right leg over. Not dismounting, but dropping, he landed on the thin man, using his full weight. The man grunted, surprised, and they both went down in the frozen mud. Caleb did not try to punch him. He drove his elbow, hard, into the man's throat. There was a terrible, wet, gagging sound. Scarface went limp, his hands clawing at his neck. The big man let go of the horse, turning, his eyes wide with surprise. He was big, but he was slow. He lumbered toward Caleb, pulling a heavy knife from his belt. Caleb was already on his feet. He did not back away. He moved inside the man's reach. He remembered the lessons of the war, the desperate, close-quarters fights in trenches. He blocked the knife arm with his left forearm, the blade slicing his coat, and drove his right fist, not at the man's face, but at his solar plexus. All his weight, all his anger, all his frustration was in that single, focused blow. The air left the big man in a whoosh. His eyes bulged. He dropped the knife, his hands clutching his stomach. He collapsed, folding in on himself, unable to breathe. It had taken less than 5 seconds. The pass was silent again, save for the thin man's choking and the big man's desperate, wheezing gasps. Caleb stood, his chest heaving, his left sleeve dark and wet where the knife had grazed him. He turned, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Morgan Vane had not moved. He was staring at his two associates, his mouth open, his face pale with a new, profound, personal terror. He had seen Caleb as a weak, sentimental fool. He was now seeing him as something else entirely. He was seeing the veteran, the hard man he had bragged about. Caleb took one step toward him. Morgan stumbled back, his hands raised. Now, Caleb, wait, just wait. It was business. Just business. We can still make a deal. Caleb kept walking. He was not angry anymore. He was cold. He was a man who had made a promise to himself. He was a man who had chosen his ground. This was his land. This was his line. Morgan, terrified, turned to run. He stumbled on the uneven trail. Falling to his knees, he looked back, his eyes pleading. Caleb, please, we are family. Caleb stopped, standing over him. He slowly, deliberately, pulled the pistol from his holster. He did not point it at Morgan. He just held it, the metal dark and heavy in his hand. Get up, he said. Morgan scrambled to his feet, his fine suit covered in mud. Get on your horse, Caleb said. Morgan obeyed, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grab the reins. He pulled himself into the saddle, a man utterly broken. Caleb looked up at him. The last light of the sun caught the cold anger in his eyes. You come back here, Morgan, Caleb said, his voice quiet. Deadly, you are finished. I will not, I swear. You send anyone else, Caleb continued, as if he had not spoken. You send the law, you send your partners, you send anyone, and I will not fight them. I will find you, in Helena, in whatever fine building you are hiding in, and I will finish this. Morgan, you cannot. That is murder. Caleb, I am not talking about the law. I am not talking about money. This is my land. He pointed up the hill, toward the cabin he could not see, but could feel, and those are my people. You will not touch them. He raised the pistol, pointing it not at Morgan, but at the sky, and fired. The shot was a single, death-splitting crack that echoed off the rocks. Morgan's horse screamed and bolted, galloping back down the trail toward Sweetwater, Morgan clinging to the saddle, a figure of pure, abject terror. Caleb stood, his arm still raised. The echo faded. The silence of the wilderness rushed back in. His two associates were groaning, one clutching his throat, the other his stomach. They were not dead. They were just broken. He holstered his pistol. He felt a deep, profound weariness. His arm was bleeding. His knuckles were raw. But he was, for the first time since the war, at peace. He had fought, not for a flag, not for an ideal, but for a home. He walked to his horse, which had stopped a few yards away, and pulled himself into the saddle. He was hurt. He was cold. But he was the owner. He turned the bay toward the cabin on the hill and rode home. The sound of the gunshot, a single, sharp explosion, ripped through the cold twilight. It was the sound of a final, brutal ending. Rosalind Dunn, who had been standing on the porch, her body rigid with a hope she did not dare to trust, felt the sound like a blow to her chest. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. She had watched him ride away, the man who had come to take her home and had instead become her fragile, unbelievable shield. She had watched him ride toward the town, toward the law, toward his cousin, and now, this, a single shot. She stared into the deepening gloom, her heart a cold, hard knot in her throat. The echoes faded, and the silence that rushed back in was vast and terrible. It was the silence of an empty pass, the silence of a man who would not be returning. She had let him. She had accepted his help, and she had sent him to his death. The man who had shown her a sliver of kindness, a moment of protection, was now lying dead on the trail. All because of her. Inside the cabin, she heard her father stir. His cough, a dry, rattling sound, was followed by a weak, questioning. "Rosalind, what was that? Was that a shot?" She could not answer. She could not move. She just stared into the darkness, her eyes burning, begging for a sign, for a rider, for anything but this crushing, absolute emptiness. And then, out of the purple shadows, a shape emerged. A horse, walking slowly, heavily, not the fast, panicked gallop of a horse without a rider. A slow, steady walk. A rider was in the saddle. He was slumped, his form a dark shape against the last light. Mr. V. Caleb. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a name she had no right to use, a name she had only said in her mind. The horse continued its steady, plodding pace up the hill, stopping only when it reached the small, cleared space in front of the porch. Caleb Vane did not dismount immediately. He sat for a moment, his head down, as if gathering his strength. Rosalind ran from the porch, her feet stumbling in the dark. She reached the horse, her hands grabbing for the reins, for his leg, for anything. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. She could see it now. His left sleeve was dark, soaked. His face was bruised, a cut on his cheek. His knuckles were raw, bloody. He was not the man who had left. He was the soldier who had returned. "It is nothing," he said, his voice a low rasp. "A graze." He swung his leg over the saddle, his movement stiff. When his boots hit the ground, his knees buckled. Rosalind, without a thought, moved to steady him, her small frame bracing his much larger one. He leaned on her, just for an instant, his weight a sudden, surprising burden. She smelled the sharp, metallic scent of his blood, the sweat, the cold pine air. "Inside," she commanded. Her voice no longer the whisper of a victim, but the firm, clear voice of a woman taking charge. "Get inside, now!" He did not argue. He let her guide him, his arm across her shoulders, up the 2 steps and onto the porch. She pushed the door open. The warm, thick air of the cabin washed over them, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and herbal tea. Jeremiah Dunn was sitting up in his chair by the fire, his thin hands gripping the wooden arms. His pale blue eyes were wide, burning with a fierce, anxious light. He stared at the 2 of them, his daughter holding up the man who had come to evict him. He saw the blood. He saw the exhaustion. "Sit," Rosalind ordered, pointing to a small, 3-legged stool near the hearth. Caleb obeyed. He sank onto the stool, the warmth of the fire hitting his face. He felt suddenly, profoundly weary, as if the last of his strength had been used to get him back to this one small room. Rosalind did not hesitate. She moved with a purpose he had only seen her use for her father. She lit another lamp, filling the room with a softer, steadier light. She stoked the fire. She went to the dry sink and poured water from a pitcher into a small basin. She tore a long strip from a clean white sheet in her mother's old chest. She knelt in front of him. "Give me your arm," she said. He looked down at her. She was on her knees before him. Not in supplication, not in a desperate, shameful bargain, but as a healer, as an equal. He slowly, painfully, worked his coat off his shoulders, letting it fall. He unbuttoned the cuff of his bloody shirt and pushed the wet fabric up past his elbow. The cut was long, from his wrist to his forearm. It was not deep, but it had bled. A long, clean slice from a knife. She dipped a rag in the water and began to clean it. Her touch was not shy. It was firm, gentle, and impersonal. It was the touch of someone who understood pain, who was not afraid of it. Caleb sat, unmoving, watching her. He watched her dark hair, illuminated by the firelight. He watched the set of her jaw, the concentration in her eyes. The war had taught him that the true measure of a person was not found in a drawing room. It was found in the mud, in the blood, in the moments when everything was on the line. He had seen men of supposed great courage fold. He had seen quiet, unassuming men perform acts of impossible bravery. This woman, kneeling before him, was the bravest person he had ever met. He had ridden out to file a paper. He had ridden into an ambush. He had fought, not with the cold, legal mind of a landowner, but with the hot, primal fury of a man defending his home, as his fist had connected with that man's gut, as he had disarmed the other, as he had faced down his cousin. One thought had been a clear, bright line in his mind. They will not touch her. He looked at her, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life had changed. The paper in his pocket, the one that said he was a tenant master, was just as much a lie as the first one. This was not a legal arrangement. This was not a matter of property. He had made a choice in that pass. He had thrown away a future of wealth and power, a future he had craved, a future he thought he had earned. He had done it for this small room, for the dying man watching him from the shadows, for the woman kneeling at his feet, her hands so gentle on his wounded arm. This, he realized, was loyalty. This was the one thing he had missed, the one thing the war had taken from him. He had been loyal to a flag, to an army, but that was gone. He had come west to be loyal only to himself, to his own advancement, and he had found it was a cold, empty thing. Now, he was loyal to them, this small, broken family, this fierce, stubborn, loving girl. He had found his line. He had found his people. The law, he understood, was just a set of rules. It was not a guide. It was not a measure of right and wrong. Right was this. Right was protecting this. She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap the clean cloth tightly around his arm. Her fingers were deft. "He will not be back," Caleb said, his voice quiet. Rosalind's hands stilled. She did not look up. "Your cousin." "He will not be back. None of them will. She tied the knot, her fingers brushing his skin. The simple, non-threatening touch was more intimate than any he had ever known. She finally raised her eyes to his. Her face was pale, stained with dirt and tears, but her eyes were clear. They were full of questions he did not know how to answer. You fought them," she whispered. Not a question, a statement. "I did. For us." He looked at her fierce, fragile beauty. He saw the strength that had offered him a sacrifice, and the softness that now tended his wounds. He saw the woman who had brought him bread in the dark. "Yes," he said. They held each other's gaze. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the old man's breathing. In that look, everything was said. The shame of her offer was burned away. The guilt of his intrusion was gone. They were no longer landowner and squatter. They were no longer victor and vanquished. They were two people, a man and a woman, who had seen the truth of each other in the ugliest of circumstances. A long, slow, dry sound came from the corner, a clearing of a throat. Caleb turned his head. Jeremiah Dunn was leaning forward in his chair. The old man's eyes, still sharp, still burning, moved from his daughter to Caleb, and then back again. He saw the blood. He saw the bandage. He saw the way they looked at each other. Jeremiah Dunn raised one of his gnarled, trembling hands. He gave a single, slow, profound nod. It was a gesture of respect, a gesture of acceptance. It was a father's blessing. Rosalind stood up, pulling Caleb with her. She did not take her hand from his arm. They stood together in the center of the small cabin, side by side, facing the hearth. They were a unit. They were a fortress. The world outside, with its greedy cousins and its blind laws, was still there. But it did not matter. Caleb Vane had come to take a man's land, and he had, in the end, found his own. He had found his home. The night was a long one, spent in the small, cramped space of the lean-to. Rosalind had insisted. She had fetched a pile of old, clean blankets and his own bedroll, and made him a pallet on the packed earth, away from the wind. She had said, "You cannot ride with that arm. You will sleep here." It was not a request. It was the same command she had used when she told him to sit, to give her his arm. The woman who had been a pleading, desperate girl was now a field nurse, a quartermaster, and he, the soldier, had simply obeyed. He woke before dawn, his body a symphony of aches. His arm throbbed with a dull, steady beat. His ribs, where the big man had landed on him, were sore. His knuckles were split and on fire, but he was alive, and he was warm. He lay for a moment in the darkness, listening. He heard the thin, whistling breath of the bay outside, and from the cabin, just feet away. He heard the two other sounds that now defined his world, the low, dry rasp of Jeremiah Dunn's breathing, and the quiet, restless stirring of Rosalind. He was a man who could not be still. He rose in the pre-dawn cold, his movements stiff. He pulled on his boots. He looked at his coat, the sleeve torn and dark with dried blood. He left it. He walked out into the gray, frozen air, wearing just his shirt, and went to the woodpile. He picked up the heavy axe, the one he had seen her struggle with. He spat on his good hand, gripped the handle, and began to work. The clean, sharp thwack of the axe splitting wood was the first sound of the new day. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm. He was not just chopping wood for the fire. He was working the stiffness out of his muscles. He was pushing back against the violence of the night before. He was, in the simplest, most fundamental way he knew, providing. The pile of split wood grew steadily beside him. The cabin door opened. He stopped, his axe buried in a thick log. Rosalind was standing there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was loose, a dark, sleep-rumpled cloud. She just watched him. The man who had come to take her land was chopping her firewood. "There is coffee," she said, her voice quiet in the vast silence. "I will be in," he said. He freed the axe and split the log with one clean blow. He gathered a full load of wood, stacking it high on his good arm, and carried it onto the porch. He did not go inside. Not yet. He set it down by the door. She came out with a steaming tin cup. He took it. Their fingers did not brush this time. He drank. It was hot, bitter, and the best thing he had ever tasted. She looked at the high pile of wood. That is enough for 3 days." "The cold is not waiting," he said. They stood in the silence of the new morning. The awkwardness between them was a thick, heavy blanket. The night before, in the heat of the confrontation, in the shared relief, they had been allies, equals. Now, in the cold light of day, they were a man and a woman who were strangers, bound by a deed, by blood, by a dying old man. "Your arm," she said. "It is fine." "It needs to be cleaned again, after breakfast." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He went back to the woodpile. She went back inside. When he finally entered the cabin, the sun was just touching the tops of the hills. The room was warm. Rosalind was at the hearth, stirring a pot of oatmeal. Jeremiah Dunn was in his chair, exactly as he had been. He was awake. His pale, burning eyes found Caleb. Caleb nodded. "Mr. Dunn." The old man looked at him. He looked at the fresh, high stack of wood by the hearth. He looked at Caleb's bruised knuckles, his torn and bloody shirt. "Finally," he gave a slow, dry nod. "Mr. Vane." It was all that was said. It was enough. They ate at the small, rough table, the three of them. Caleb sat on the stool, Rosalind on a bench, and she brought a small bowl to her father. They ate in silence. The scrape of spoons against tin was the only sound. It was not an angry silence. It was a new silence, the silence of a family, too new and too fragile to know what to say. After, she cleaned and rewrapped his arm. Her touch was as gentle, as professional as before. He sat still, letting her. He was not used to being tended. He was the one who endured, but he found, to his surprise, that he did not mind it. That day set the rhythm for the days that followed. The cold deepened. The sky turned a hard, bright blue. Winter was no longer a threat. It was a siege. And they were, all three of them, inside the fortress, preparing. Caleb Vane became a force of pure, focused labor. He was a man with a new mission. He moved his bedroll and his tack into the small, dry lean-to permanently. He spent the first day repairing the roof, using old lumber he found behind the cabin. He made it weather-tight. He worked from sunup to sundown. Rosalind watched him. She saw the soldier in him, the relentless discipline, but it was not directed at them. It was directed for them. He did not ask permission. He just saw what was broken, and he fixed it. He replaced the rotted porch step. He rechinked the logs on the west wall, the one that took the worst of the wind. He used the mud and straw she mixed for him, their hands sometimes touching in the cold, wet mixture. On the third day, he took his rifle and went into the hills. Rosalind was terrified. She had not even known he had a rifle. She thought he had just the pistol. She thought he was leaving. She spent the day in a quiet, simmering panic, tending to her father, her ears straining for the sound of a horse. He returned just before dusk. He was on foot. Thrown over his shoulders was a large mule deer. He had not wasted a bullet. He was a provider. He had brought them meat, enough, if cured and smoked, to last half the winter. That night, she taught him how to smoke meat, using the small, cold smokehouse her father had built years ago. They worked late by lantern light, their hands bloody, their faces smudged with soot and salt. They worked as a team, as if they had been doing it for years. The barrier of awkwardness was dissolving, worn away by the simple, shared tasks of survival. He began to talk. Not much, but it was a start. He told her, as they cut the meat, about hunting in the forests of his home state. Long ago, before the war. He did not talk about the war. Not yet. She, in turn, told him about her mother, about the garden she had planted. She loved this land, she said, her voice soft in the smoky dark. She used to say the wind in the pines was the land's own voice, singing. Caleb stopped cutting. He looked at her, at the way the lantern light caught the sorrow and strength in her face. He just nodded and went back to work. Inside the cabin, Jeremiah Dunn was holding on. He seemed to have a new spark. Some days, he would sit at the window and watch Caleb work. He watched him rehang the gate so it did not scrape the ground. He watched him restack the stone fence near the lean-to. One afternoon, Caleb was reinforcing the small cow corral. Jeremiah's voice, dry as leaves, came from the open window. "You are setting that post too shallow, Mr. Vane." Caleb stopped, his shovel halfway into the ground. "The frost here," Jeremiah rasped. "It heaves. You need to go another foot, or it will push it right back out by spring." Caleb looked at the old man's thin, pale face in the window. He looked at the hole. Then he nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Dunn." He began to dig deeper. It was a passing of the torch. The old man, the builder, was giving his knowledge to the new one. He was, in his own way, giving his land and his daughter into this new man's care. A week after the fight, a rider came. Caleb saw him from the roof of the cabin, where he was patching a shingle. It was Sheriff Brody. Caleb climbed down, his hammer in his hand. Rosalind came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. They stood together, side by side, as the sheriff reined in. "Mr. Vane, ma'am." The sheriff nodded. He looked at the new stack of firewood. He looked at the new gate. He looked at the two of them, standing together like a man and wife. He seemed to understand that the entire world had shifted on this small patch of land. "Sheriff," Caleb said. "Just wanted to let you know," Brody said, his voice dry. "I was in Sweetwater. Heard some news from Helena. Thought it might interest you." Caleb waited. "Seems your cousin, Morgan Vane, has left the territory in a hurry." "Is that so?" Caleb said. "Yes, seems his associates." The sheriff's eyes twinkled just a little. "The two men you had a disagreement with, they were found on the trail by a freighter. They were hurt, but talkative. Seems they were wanted men. Escaped from the prison in Deer Lodge. When Morgan's partners in Helena heard he had brought in known outlaws, bringing that kind of heat on their investments, they were not pleased. At all." The sheriff spat a bit of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Seems Morgan Vane is not just broke. He is a pariah. His own partners ran him out. He overplayed his hand. He will not be back." Caleb felt the last, final thread of tension leave his body. It was over. The law, the money, the greed, it was all gone. Morgan had been handled, not by Caleb's violence, but by his own. "Thank you, Sheriff," Caleb said. "Just doing my job, Mr. Vane." The sheriff looked at Rosalind, then back at Caleb. "Good day to you. Looks like you are ready for the winter." "We are," Caleb said. The sheriff nodded, turned his horse, and rode away. Caleb and Rosalind stood for a long time, watching him go. The world was quiet. There was no one coming. It was just them, just the three of them, and the land. Rosalind let out a breath she felt she had been holding for her entire life. She turned, and before she could stop herself, she rested her hand on Caleb's good arm. His muscles were hard as stone beneath his shirt. "It is over," she whispered. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. Yes, they stayed like that, just for a moment. Two statues in the cold, bright sun. Then she pulled her hand away, her face flushing, and hurried back inside, back to her father. That evening, the work was done. The air was sharp, and the sky was a deep, clear purple, streaked with veins of orange and red. The sun was gone, leaving only its burning promise behind. Caleb and Rosalind stood on the porch, looking out over the land. It was not a rich land. It was not a grand land. But it was theirs. The mended fence was a dark line in the twilight. The woodpile was a fortress. "He is sleeping," Rosalind said, her voice soft. "My father, he seems to be in peace. The doctor, he was wrong. He said the winter would take him. But I think he was just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Caleb asked. "To know I was safe." She turned to him. "He told me this afternoon. He said my mother would have been grateful to you." Caleb felt his throat tighten. He, a man of few words, had none. He looked at the dying light on the hills. "Rosalind," he said, the name still new, still strange on his tongue. "I came here. I was a man who believed in paper, in law. I thought it was the only thing holding the world together." "I know," she said. He turned to her. "I was wrong. It is not law. It is this. It is people, holding on, protecting what they love. You taught me that." "And you," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. "You taught me that the world is not just full of men like your cousin, that there is goodness even when it is hard." He reached out, his hand rough, calloused, his knuckles still scarred. He did not grab her. He did not touch her face. He just, slowly, took her hand. Her hand was small, just as rough, just as calloused as his own. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect, wordless fit. "We will make it through the winter," he said. "It was a promise." She did not answer. She just squeezed his hand and leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. They stood together, a man and a woman, battered and scarred, but whole, watching the last of the light fade, leaving them under a blanket of stars, alone and at peace, on their land. The first snow came not with violence, but as a whisper. It began in the night, a silent, steady sift of white from a sky that was the color of iron. When Caleb rose from his pallet in the lean-to, the world was gone. The brown, hard-scrabble land had vanished, replaced by a smooth, deep blanket of white. The mended fences were soft, white ridges. The woodpile was a snow-capped mountain. The only sound was the muffled stamp of his horse and the huff of its breath, a white plume in the perfectly still, perfectly cold air. He went about his morning tasks, his movements quiet, respectful of the great hush. He shoveled a path from the lean-to the cabin porch, and another to the woodpile. When he entered the cabin, the warmth and the light were a haven. Rosalind was at the hearth, a thick shawl around her shoulders. She gave him a small, tired smile. Her father, she whispered, had had a restless night, but he was sleeping now. The winter sealed them in. The world shrank to the one small room, the lean-to, and the paths he kept clear between them. The wind, which had been a threat, was now a constant, howling presence. It piled drifts as high as the cabin roof on the north side, but the wall Caleb had re-chinked held firm. He became a man of steady, powerful rhythms. He fed and watered the stock, the bay, the single bony cow, and the few hardy chickens. He hunted, his rifle a sharp, lonely crack in the vast whiteness, returning with rabbits or a grouse. He kept the woodpile stacked, a bulwark against the cold. Rosalind, in turn, kept the fire, the heart of their world. She cooked, transforming their meager supplies, his deer, the salted pork, the oatmeal, the hard winter potatoes from the root cellar into warm, life-sustaining meals. She tended to her father, her patience a quiet, unwavering light. And Caleb, the man who had come to take, became the man who gave. He sat with Jeremiah. The old man, confined to his bed now, was weaker, but his mind was sharp. His eyes, those pale, burning blue lights, would follow Caleb. At first, it was with suspicion, but as the weeks wore on, it changed. One blizzard-bound afternoon, when the wind was so loud it seemed the cabin itself might take flight, Jeremiah, in a fit of coughing, gasped, "The book, my Mary's book!" Rosalind pulled a worn, leather-bound volume from the small chest. It was a book of poems. He cannot see the words anymore," she whispered to Caleb. "And my reading is not so good." Caleb took the book. His own hands, rough and scarred from work and war, felt clumsy on the delicate, dry pages. He sat on the stool by the bed. "Where would you like me to start?" Mr. Dunn. "The beginning," Jeremiah rasped. And so Caleb Vane, the soldier, the hard man, began to read. His voice, rough and low, filled the small cabin, a counter-rhythm to the shrieking wind. He read about gardens and the sea and old kings. He read for an hour, until his throat was dry and the old man's breathing had eased into a shallow, peaceful sleep. He did this every day after. He read as Rosalind mended their clothes by the firelight, her needle a small, flashing star. He read as the snow piled deeper and deeper outside. In these quiet, domestic moments, the man he had been the man of ledgers and laws felt like a stranger, a ghost from another life. One night, he sat in the lean-to by the light of his lantern, cleaning his rifle. He had pulled his saddlebags inside to protect the leather from the deep cold. His fingers brushed against the papers inside. He pulled them out. There it was, the original deed, the document from the Helena Bank, crisp and legal, declaring him the sole owner. And beside it was the other paper, the one from Sweetwater, the one that said tenancy agreement. He looked at them, the two opposing facts of his new life. He thought of Morgan and the men in Helena. To them, this was all just a square on a map, a sum in a ledger. They would never see the way the snowdrifts formed on the porch rail. They would never hear the sound of Rosalind humming as she baked bread. They would not know the weight of an old man's trust, or the strength in a woman's hand. He, Caleb Vane, had almost been one of them. He had almost traded this reality, for a piece of paper. He had learned, in this small, snowbound room, that a home is not a thing you own. It is a thing you protect. It is a thing you earn. He had come to take a property, and instead, he had been given a life. He put the tenancy agreement back, the original deed, the one that had started it all. He held for a long moment. Then, he opened the door of the small stove in his lean-to and fed the paper to the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished. He felt nothing. It was not a sacrifice. It was just irrelevant. The winter reached its apex, then broke. The days began to lengthen, the sun gaining a weak, watery warmth. The great melt began. The world became a sea of mud and running water. And as the land began to breathe again, Jeremiah Dunn began to let go. He passed on a clear, cold morning in early March. The last of the snow was still in the shadows, but a warm wind, a chinook, was blowing from the west, a promise of spring. He had not spoken in 2 days. Rosalind sat on the edge of his bed, holding one of his gnarled hands. Caleb stood at the foot, his hat in his hand. Jeremiah's eyes opened. They were no longer burning. They were pale, clear, and peaceful. He looked at his daughter. He managed a slight pressure on her hand. Then, his gaze shifted, moving past her, to Caleb. He looked at him for a long, steady moment. He gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, a transfer, a final peace. Then he looked at the window, at the bright, morning light on the land he had loved, and he let out a long, final breath. Rosalind did not cry. Not then. She just lowered her head, pressed his hand to her cheek, and sat in the profound, New silence. Caleb Vane dug the grave. He dug it on the hill, under the great pine, next to the small, weathered stone that marked where Mary Dunn lay. The ground was hard, still frozen in the deep, but his arms were strong from a winter of chopping wood, and his will was absolute. He worked all day, the steady sound of his shovel and pick the only sound on the hill. They buried him the next evening, just the two of them. Rosalind read a passage from her mother's book of poems. Caleb said nothing. He just stood, his hat over his heart, a guardian at his post. When it was done, and the last of the cold earth was in place, they stood side by side, looking out at the valley. The sun was setting. The same orange and purple streaks he had seen that first night on the porch. The land was theirs, not by law, not by paper, by love, by loss, by a shared promise to the two people who slept beneath their feet. Spring came on in a rush. The brown earth, fed by the deep snow, erupted in a sudden, shocking wave of green. The creek in the hollow, once sluggish, now ran fast and clear. The air was full of the scent of damp earth and new pine. Life, which had been suspended, began again. Caleb moved his things from the lean-to into the cabin. It was not discussed. It was a natural, unspoken thing. He took the pallet by the fire. He was a part of the house now. They began to work the fields. He found the old man's plow, its blade rusted. He spent 2 days cleaning it, sharpening it, mending the harness. He hitched his bay, a saddle horse not meant for plowing, but the animal pulled with a steady will, as if it, too, understood. He did not just plow the old, barren patches. He broke new ground, the rich, dark soil of the low meadow. Closer to the creek, Rosalind worked beside him. She was not the frail, desperate girl on the porch. She was strong, her hands deft. She planted the seeds they had found in the cellar: corn, beans, potatoes. She brought him water. They ate their lunch sitting in the shade of the bay, their backs against a new, warm stone. Their love was as quiet and as steady as their work. It was not a thing of grand passions or fiery declarations. It was in the way he stopped and watched her walk back to the cabin, a quiet admiration in his eyes. It was in the way she set a plate for him at the table, a plate that was always just a little fuller than her own. It was in the shared, comfortable silences on the porch in the evening, the two of them watching the green shoots push up from the dark earth. One evening, he was mending the corral fence, the one Jeremiah had advised him on. The post he had set, the one he had dug deeper, was solid as a rock. Rosalind came out, carrying a small bucket of whitewash. She began to paint the porch rails. He stopped his work and watched her. She had a smudge of white on her cheek. Her hair was tied back, and the evening sun lit the escaped strands like a halo. He had been a man with a simple mission to take a piece of land. He had been a man who believed in the simple, hard lines of the law. He looked at her, at the simple, profound beauty of her in the golden light, and he knew his life had been saved. He had been saved from a future of emptiness, of profit, of being a man like Morgan Vane. He walked over to her. She looked up, a small, questioning smile on her face. He did not say he loved her. He did not need to. He just reached out his rough hand and gently, with his thumb, wiped the smudge of white from her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for just an instant. He had come to claim his property. He had found his humanity. He had learned that the only true deed is the one you write on the land with your own hands, and the only true ownership is the loyalty you give to another human soul. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.